The hidden pain of quiet people. The hidden pain of suppressed authenticity and chronic vigilance. Quiet people often carry an inherited survival mechanism, the belief that safety comes from silence. They learned early that being unseen was the only way to avoid rejection, chaos, or shame. The paradox? The very quietness that once protected them now isolates them, turning their inner world into both a refuge and a prison. The high-impact hook and core paradox. You were never really just quiet. You were watching, listening, calculating the emotional weather before stepping into the room. You learned to notice everything: the tightening of someone's jaw, the sudden shift in tone, the small, almost invisible signs that something wasn't safe. You became fluent in silence because silence was how you survived. Maybe you were the child who stayed in your room, reading or drawing, because it was easier to live inside your imagination than in a world that felt unpredictable. Maybe you were the one who avoided confrontation, who carried peace like a shield. And over time, people started calling you the quiet one. But that label was never neutral. It was armor. Your quietness wasn't born from serenity. It was born from vigilance, from learning that words can turn dangerous, that being too visible could invite disapproval or disappointment or pain. So you mastered the art of self-erasure. You became the person who disappears just enough to stay safe. And here lies the paradox, the cruel symmetry of your story. The silence that once protected you is now the silence that suffocates you. Because as an adult, that same instinct to withdraw, to watch, to overthink, keeps you isolated from connection. The walls that once shielded you now keep love out. The restraint that made you easy to be around has become the reason no one really sees you. You learned to be quiet so you wouldn't be hurt. But in doing so, you taught the world not to notice you. And now when someone asks, "Why are you so quiet?" you don't even know how to answer. Because how do you explain that silence isn't your choice? It's your history. It's the sound of a nervous system that never felt safe enough to rest. Definition and psychological authority. Psychologically, the quiet person archetype often emerges from environments where emotional expression was unsafe, invalidated, or ignored. The technical term for this adaptation is hypervigilance, the chronic scanning of one's environment for potential threats. In childhood, this often develops when a parent's emotions are unpredictable. One day loving, the next day critical or withdrawn. The child learns, if I stay still, if I say less, if I observe, I might avoid triggering them. But hypervigilance doesn't disappear when you grow up. It becomes the architecture of your personality. Neuroscientifically, this state is maintained by the amygdala, the brain's fear center, which remains overactive even in the absence of danger. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for emotional regulation and decision-making, becomes conditioned to anticipate disapproval before it even occurs. This creates a constant background hum of anxiety, a state of readiness that never finds resolution. There's another concept at play here: avoidant attachment, as defined by attachment theory. This style develops when a child's emotional needs are consistently unmet. The the child learns to rely on themselves, to not ask for comfort, to expect that closeness will lead to disappointment. As adults, avoidantly attached individuals may appear independent, calm, or quiet. But underneath lies a deep fear of vulnerability, the belief that to need someone is to risk rejection. Finally, consider the default mode network, a network in the brain that activates during rest and self-reflection. For many quiet people, this network becomes overdeveloped. They live in constant introspection, replaying past interactions, anticipating future ones. The mind becomes a hall of mirrors, endlessly analyzing what could have gone wrong, what could have been said differently, how they might have seemed to others. So when we talk about quiet people, we are not describing temperament alone. We are describing a nervous system trained to survive through restraint. It's not that they don't have things to say. It's that every word passes through 1,000 filters of fear and self-assessment before it's allowed to leave their mouth. They are not emotionless. They are overloaded. They are not detached. They are monitoring. They are not boring. They are guarded. Quietness, in this context, is not personality. It's protection. The emotional cost and philosophical weight. But this protection has a price. A quiet person's internal life often carries a grief that has no name. It's the grief of not being known, the sorrow of being misunderstood as disinterested when you were simply scared, the ache of watching others form connections easily, while you remain on the edge, waiting for a safety that never comes. This is what I call the loneliness of invisibility. A loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being unseen while surrounded by people. Philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once said, "The most painful state of being is remembering the future, particularly the one you'll never have." Quiet people live inside that paradox, aware of what they could be, aware of the love they could give, the laughter they could share, but unable to step across the invisible boundary of fear that keeps them small. They carry an inner tension between longing and safety. They crave to be understood but dread being exposed. They want to speak, but every attempt feels like stepping onto thin ice. At the root of this conflict lies the fear of vulnerability, not because they dislike openness, but because openness was once punished. Maybe you were told you were too sensitive. Maybe every time you expressed emotion, someone minimized it. So now, you hide your truth not to deceive others, but to protect your heart. Over time, this self-suppression becomes existential. You begin to confuse peace with numbness. You start to think that quiet equals stability, when in fact, it's stagnation. You tell yourself, "I'm fine," when what you really mean is, "I've learned to live with my own absence." The quiet person's hidden pain is not that they cannot speak. It's that they no longer trust their voice to matter. And that loss, the loss of self-expression, of authentic visibility, is not a small thing. It's a spiritual injury. Carl Jung wrote, "Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent." For the quiet person, this is the haunting truth. When you silence yourself long enough, you don't just lose your voice. You lose the version of you that might have existed if you had been allowed to be loud, messy, human. Adult manifestation and the unlearning. So how does this early silence echo into adulthood? It shows up in subtle, almost invisible ways, ways that are easy to misinterpret. You might be the one who overthinks every text message, rereading it 20 times before pressing send, afraid of being misunderstood. You might stay quiet in meetings, even when you have something brilliant to say, because speaking up feels like standing naked under a spotlight. You might avoid conflict at all costs, confusing harmony with love, believing that staying calm is safer than being honest. You might attract emotionally unavailable people because your nervous system recognizes their distance as normal. You might apologize excessively, even when you've done nothing wrong, because your body remembers the cost of being blamed. And perhaps most painfully, you might feel unseen in your closest relationships, unable to explain why even love feels slightly out of reach. These are not random quirks. They are coping strategies misidentified as personality traits. Quiet people are often praised for being calm, patient, introspective. But underneath those compliments lies a subtle misunderstanding. Calmness is often suppression. Patience is often fear. Introspection is often isolation. And yet, to unlearn this quietness is not to become loud. It's to become authentic. The first step is witnessing. To look at your quietness not as a flaw, but as a message. To ask yourself not, "What's wrong with me?" but, "What happened to me that taught me to hide?" Because self-gaslighting, telling yourself that you're just shy or just introverted, keeps the wound buried. Healing begins when you name the truth. I became quiet to stay safe. When you begin to understand that your silence is not a defect, you can start experimenting with safety. Speaking one sentence more than you normally would. Sharing one vulnerable truth with someone you trust. Saying no, even when your instinct says to avoid tension. Every act of expression becomes a small rebellion against your old conditioning. And the beautiful thing? Your quietness is not something to erase. It's something to reclaim. Because there's a difference between silence born from fear and silence chosen from peace. The goal is not to force yourself into noise. It's to find the version of silence that feels alive, not defensive. When you speak from authenticity, even softly, it carries more power than any performance ever could. The healing, conclusion, and affirmation. Healing the hidden pain of quietness is not about becoming someone else. It's about coming home to the person you were before you learned to hide. This process often begins with inner child reparenting, the act of becoming the safe adult your younger self never had. When you notice yourself withdrawing, you pause and gently say, "You're safe now. You can speak." This internal dialogue rewires your nervous system over time, teaching your brain that expression no longer equals danger. Then there's shadow work, confronting the parts of yourself you've silenced, the anger, the sadness, the unmet needs. Quiet people often suppress their loud emotions, but reclaiming those feelings is how you reclaim your vitality. And perhaps the most powerful step is choosing softness, not as weakness, but as strength. To live in a world that rewards noise and still choose depth, awareness, and intentional speech is a radical act. Because the truth is, quiet people are not broken. They are attuned, exquisitely, painfully attuned. Their silence hides wisdom, empathy, and depth that others rarely possess. But that wisdom needs to breathe. The philosopher Nietzsche once said, "The voice of beauty speaks softly. It creeps only into the most fully awakened souls." So perhaps your quietness was never a flaw. It was the soil in which sensitivity grew. But sensitivity without safety becomes suffering. Healing, then, is about learning to be quiet without being afraid. To let your stillness be a choice, not a cage. To understand that you were never meant to disappear, only to observe, to feel, and then to speak from that feeling. You are not too quiet. You are someone whose soul was forced into silence, now remembering its sound. And maybe the world doesn't need you to speak louder. It needs you to speak truer. Because when a quiet person finally finds their voice, it doesn't echo. It resonates. It carries the weight of everything they've ever held inside. So, if this spoke to you, not as content, but as recognition, share it. Not for me, but for the others who still believe their silence means they don't matter. They deserve to know what you're learning now. That healing isn't about becoming loud. It's about becoming whole.